up to be the best day. For one, I thought my family was doing something tonight, and it turns out I was very, very wrong. For two, I forgot that I had to record a review for this book. And I really don't want to remember this book. However, I did finally get my Chelsea Freeman shirt. Holy cow, was that an ordeal. I know on the website it said pre-orders might take this long to come. How in the world does it need to take that long? Like, are you just waiting for a certain number of orders before saying, yes, we actually have them, or we'll order them, or we'll manufacture them in order to get them to you? I don't know. It was annoying, and I wish we'd had a bit more information in that interim time rather than just saying it's going to take a really long time to actually give them to you. I'm loving it, though. I've got my sparkly stars. The sleeves, though, I think are my favorite part. The whole reason I bought this sweatshirt. I have another one coming in because as soon as the Braves won the World Series, I was like, taking that one. So even though it's not my usual style, I will be wearing that one as soon as it comes in. In any case, on to today's book. As I mentioned, I forgot to do a review of this one. I knew I was forgetting something, but I had a host of reviews to do. Not because I was lazy, but because I was working so much that I was getting through the books, but I didn't have time to review the books. And so I said, I know I'm forgetting one, but I made a list, and I was like, I've done all of those, so I have no idea what I'm forgetting. And then I was working, and I said, oh my gosh, I know exactly what book I have forgotten to review. So it has been a good month, maybe two, since I've read the book. That means there was a lot that I'd forgotten. Plot-wise, I was pretty good. Character-wise, though, I needed a few names. So I was going through other people's reviews, and eventually I got everything I needed. I feel half bad about the fact that I hated this book because some of these reviewers loved it. And I can see elements of why they loved it. However, my soul is soothed by the fact that most people agreed with me for one reason or another. And then there's the fact that I read her other books. I should have written that down. Did I do it? No. Did I tell myself, Beth, do it? Yes. And I don't know why, I keep airdropping something to myself. And I don't want to airdrop it to myself because I've already airdropped it to myself. Let's Google. Google is my best friend. Yes, hello. Because she's my best friend. She don't need no lift. Passenger and Wayfarer. Wayfarer is the book that I could remember the title of. Passenger is not. I enjoyed Passenger. Wayfarer, I thought, dropped the ball. It took all these wonderful ideas and all of this wonderful storytelling, and it made it all pointless. And it was incredibly boring. Lore. If you can't tell, it deals a lot with Greek mythology, which is another reason that I thought I'd give the book a chance, because I really enjoy Greek mythology. However, I thought that Bracken's attempts at melding the real world with mythology was heavy-handed. It felt forced. It didn't integrate well. And so it was hard to enjoy the story because it wasn't something similar in which we take a story from mythology, or we even just take mythological beings and create a story around them set in the present day. It was like, here's our mythology, here's the real world, and we're gonna put them like this, but instead of doing this, they just do this. So they fought each other. Plus, her main character, Lore, she was not enjoyable. I don't mind a tough character. I don't mind a character that I don't really like, because sometimes just because you're the main character does not mean you're likable, does not mean you're sympathetic. I still want to attach and care and want to root for them or be part of their story. But Lore and what I need to do is actually, there is one girl who I thought hit everything on the head with her observations. So actually what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna pull up her little website, her blog, and if I am smart enough, I'm going to try to link her blog down below because I really enjoyed it. And then there was another girl where I didn't necessarily agree with her thoughts and opinions, but I liked her blog enough that I was like, this is really clever. So I'm going to try to link her as well. But the first girl, her website is called Fairy Loot. So it's really cool. She does these things called read-alongs where she'll take a couple days to summarize certain parts of books until you get to the end. So it's really fun. If you're like me and you don't necessarily want to read it all, but you want the highlights so that you understand what happened in the book. It took me 3 tries to get into lore, or just to start lore. I was so confused. The deal with lore is the gods did something. And so Zeus, to punish them, created what's called the Agon, which means that every 7 years, these gods come to Earth in mortal form and have to fight to the death. I never quite figured out what the end game is, but if they were killed by a human, that human could then absorb their godhood, and then at the end of, I think it's like a week's time period, all the gods, the old and the new, would go back to wherever they came from and do what they did until the next Agon, and then they come back to Earth and do it all over again, and they all had clans, and like they were descendants of certain gods and this and that and the other. And then Lore, her name is Melora Perseus, so she came from the god Perseus, and she is the last of her line for various reasons, but she has sworn off the Agon and everything that comes with it. And then when the book opens, she is approached by Athena, and Athena says, I need your help. And then we move on from there. So in my attempts to understand what the Agon is, because we start with a prologue that I thought was unnecessary, because we are introduced to characters and concepts that don't make sense because they had no context. And so eventually, as you get through the book, you understand what was happening in the prologue, but I don't think that's how it should work. You should not be so confused by the prologue that you can't go forward. Okay, yes, the prologue should introduce elements that you're unfamiliar with, because you're unfamiliar with the book. But if you're going to introduce a certain amount or a certain kind of element that is foreign to your reader, you need to give an explanation within the prologue, and it just didn't do it. So, anywho, that all goes back to my attempts to understand what I was getting into, and I found this girl's blog. It was just so funny. I loved it so much. And then when I was reviewing, trying to remember everything and all the characters, I ran across it again, and I loved it just as much, which is why I want to share it with you. One thing I really, 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 really hate is when someone says, I'm going to talk about a book. I mean, this is the whole reason I created this channel. I'm going to talk about a book, but I'm not going to tell you anything. How do you talk about a book without spoilers? And so I really, really hate when someone's like, so I'm going to, it's hard for me to tell you anything without spoilers. Well, duh. Otherwise, everybody's just gonna go read the book jacket. Why do you have a blog if you're not gonna tell people things that they can't already get on their own? All right, so it turns out that it's not necessarily a personal blog, but it's called The Young Folks. So it's a bunch of people who review books and movies. But I'm loving it. Megan Stanley. Imagine the world of Percy Jackson with the Hunger Games happening every 7 years, in which tributes are not children, but the Greek gods themselves. This essentially is the concept of lore, the latest YA fantasy offering from the lovely Alexandra Bracken, who I am sure she's a lovely person. Do I think she's a lovely writer? Not quite. In the world of lore, the Greek gods are real. Every 7 years, as punishment for a rebellion, 9 gods walk the earth as mortals and are hunted by the descendants of ancient Greek heroes. The hunter who successfully kills a god receives that god's power and becomes a new god themselves. This is the Agon. The story centers on Lore, a god hunter turned fist fighter descendant of the ancient house of Perseus, who had tried to escape the bloodbath of the Agon after her family was brutally murdered by a cheating rival house in the last cycle. However, a new Agon is about to start, and it's set in her stomping grounds, New York City. When a thought-to-be-dead childhood friend suddenly tracks her down, asking for her help with the hunt, and she finds the goddess Athena bleeding on the front steps of her brownstone, offering her a deal to seek vengeance on her family's murderer, Lore realizes that she cannot escape her past. Blood must be spilled and God slain, or humanity will be brought to its knees. Really, really good summary. But she goes, the novel engaged me with its original concept of the god and goddess murder spree that is the Agon. With that said, the characters lacked the emotional connection and depth that I hoped to experience. Don't get me wrong, Lore has a terribly sad backstory, and her desire to run away from that pain makes sense. However, and this is where we are on the same page, sister, she's missing the essential charisma that a main character needs to connect with a reader. She feels emotionally blocked off from the reader. One moment she acts dark and brooding, wrestling with trauma, and the next she's cracking jokes with her buddy Miles, which I completely agree. It was really hard to see her go from one persona to another because it felt really forced. I was like, Lore did not feel like a character that could have fun, that could be lighthearted. And so whenever she did do those things, it felt forced and made me roll my eyes. The inconsistency gives me emotional whiplash. I'm just saying. Her character simply lacks the emotional intelligence needed to make a fantastic concept and plot like this hit us in the feels. And honestly, most of what I've said for Lore can be said for the rest of the characters as well, which I agree, in the sense that they all felt one-dimensional. Except for maybe Miles, who is Lore's best friend. I felt like they all had a role to fill, and they didn't go beyond those parameters. And even with Miles, he was the jokester. He was the guy that lifted everybody's spirits, yet then he would try to get all serious, or he... Okay, I'm just saying, guys, if you're thrust into this, if somebody just came up to you and said, mythology is real, like Athena is in my house, what would you say? I would probably run for the hills. I don't care if you're my best friend. I might give you a little credence because you're my best friend, but I would get as far away from my best friend as possible. Miles is like, okay, I accept it, and let me be a go-between. Not that he is a scaredy cat character, but he doesn't strike me as someone who's incredibly brave and will put himself in grave danger. As much as I enjoyed him, I didn't always understand what he did, and I didn't understand his need in the book. And there are a lot of characters in this book, a lot of characters, because there's a lot of clans. I'd gotten it wrong when I said that Perseus was a god and that she was descendant of a god. It's mythological heroes. There are a lot of mythological heroes out there, which means there are a lot of clans. So it is difficult to keep track of who is who. With that, you would get a lot of people who you think they're going to be important, only for them to turn out to be nothing at all. It was a very overwhelming book. But what else did they have to say? What else does Megan have to say? On the positive side, the high intensity action and always on the move mentality kept the story from dragging. I don't quite agree with that. I thought there was a lot of action for sure, but almost too much. And there was a lack of focus in this book. The whole idea is Lore doesn't want to be part of the Agon. She is drawn into it, and she has an agenda because she wants to kill the person she thinks killed her family. I guess in the end, the main goal is to end the Agon. However, we are not given a clear idea as to what that would take. So it's open-ended. Then her desire to find this guy who is the new Ares, so his name is Wrath, her desire to find him and defeat him is often lost in all these minor quests. And when I say minor, they actually felt more major than that quest because they took precedence. They took center stage. And so sometimes you actually forgot why she got involved in all this in the first place. And then her thing with Athena, I forgot like why she had teamed up with Athena, which was essentially to seek vengeance again on the people that had hurt her. So yes, there was a lot of action, but it was overwhelming. And then we would have these really slow parts because we had a lot of internal monologue and a lot of sitting around and figuring things out, and all these side notes of things that were happening that, because they took away from the focus, slowed it down again. I tend to like going back in time and seeing things that happened in the past. For this book, I thought we could have done without it. It dragged it down, and it kind of did what most prologues do, where it gives us information that we could have gotten elsewhere. We got enough of what happened to Laura's family from the present tense that we didn't actually need to go back to the past and see it happen. As I have said, a lot going on, and in some cases it slowed it down rather than help keep a momentum. But what else does Megan have to say? I feel like this is Megan's review today, not mine. I just feel like she articulates it a lot better than I could do, simply because it's been so long since I've read the book. One final note. For readers expecting romance, and this cracks me up. It cracked me up the first time I read it, and I was hoping that this person was exaggerating. No. One final note. For readers expecting romance, it's there, but it's not even in the back seat. It's in the trunk. While I do enjoy a good childhood friend romance, the author makes the mistake of putting too much stock in that we will care about a childhood friend of Laura's even though we didn't get to experience that history. Very true. And not even did we not get to experience the history, we didn't get to experience the present. There were great chunks of time in which they weren't even together. There was a lot of misunderstanding, because the thing about the childhood friend who was Castor, he had suffered from leukemia, which I thought was a really interesting aspect of this novel, and I wouldn't have minded a little bit more exploration of it. I think if we had explored it some more, it would have felt like too much unnecessary, because it didn't have anything to do with the novel per se. It was more about a backstory for him, and it gives you an inkling as to what might have happened to him and why things turned out for him the way they did. See what I did there? I said a lot of things without saying anything at all. Those are the kinds of reviews that I hate. But you know me, I'll give you the details. I just don't want to get too off track. I don't even remember where I was. So we're just going to start somewhere else. Castor, when he shows back up, I think that's where I was going. When he shows back up into her life, he shows up at her fight. She realizes she's fighting her childhood best friend, whom she thought had died 7 years ago. He's obviously gorgeous and tall and built. He lets her win. But with that, he's saying, I need your help. And this is before she runs across Athena. He's saying, I need your help, things are happening, blah, blah, blah. And then he just disappears. When we see him again, we realize that he is a new god. And there's so much that goes into that I need to talk about. Oh my gosh, there's so much about that. Such a disappointment. Castor was such a disappointment. We realize that he's the new god, Apollo. Then they end up in the same room together. Things get really chaotic. There's chaos, which means they're not doing anything meaningful. And then they split up to take care of certain things, and then they come together, and then they get angry at each other, and they split up again. And I felt like the romance was, one, based off of a childhood friendship that we got very little context on, and then two, based off the fact that he's now really hot. So it was totally a total trunk romance. So she rounds out her review by saying that while the characters ultimately felt a tad forced and hollow, which I think that's very generous, Its dynamite concept and use of Greek mythology makes the story worth reading. Do not let that mislead you. It is not worth reading. It is a dynamite concept. If you like Greek mythology, by all means, check it out. But as I said, the Greek mythology fought with the realistic nature of the world she sets it in, her inability to focus, her abundance of ideas failed to deliver on her dynamic concept. Okay, so let's talk about some of these characters like Castor. Lore thought he died, which I think is really interesting. Why she would think he died and not have any proof of it? Perhaps because, I mean, there are so many cliches in this book. Is perhaps because her family were such outcasts and she wasn't welcome in her training facility, which is where he lived, that when he did die, they weren't going to let her know. And then on that same night, her family died and she got out of town. So perhaps those are the reasons why she never knew Castor died. But I thought that was hard to swallow, that she could have a best friend and all of a sudden lose complete and total contact with him and just assume he died. It was weak. He comes back and it turns out that he is the new Apollo. So there's Artemis, Athena, and Apollo. There are, I think, 2 more original gods, but Artemis, Athena, and Apollo were siblings. Forgive me, I need to brush up on my mythology. Athena and Artemis, or perhaps all 3, whatever, had teamed up in order to try and not lose the Agon, in order to defeat everybody else. When they learn that Apollo has died and he is now in the body of this kid, they're really angry. I don't understand how this all works. So what I do know is, if a god kills a god, they cannot imbue that god's essence. That god is just done. So if Athena kills Apollo, Apollo cannot return in someone else's body. Whereas if Lore killed Apollo, Lore can then become the new Apollo because she is not a god herself. Even if she was a new god, that new god could not imbue the power of another god, therefore completely cutting out that god's lifespan. I guess it just all goes back to, I don't understand the whole rationale behind the Agon and what their end game is, because it seems to me that it is the song that never ends. Does anybody know that? This is the song that never ends. Yes, it goes on and on, my friends. One day we started singing it, not knowing what it was, and we'll continue singing it forever just because it is the song that never ends, and on and on and on. So it seems to me that's what the Agon is. Like, there is no end to the Agon, because even if all of the old original gods are killed, their essence will continue on, unless maybe they're thinking that if a god kills everybody else so that they are the last remaining god, then that ends the Agon. As I said, there were so many ideas in this book that I couldn't figure out what was up and what was down. Artemis and Athena are extremely mad at Castor/Apollo. Now, they try to kill him whenever they can see him too, but Lore had banded together with Athena, and what that means is that they essentially make this pact that says, I will get your strength, you will get my strength, but if one of us dies, the other one will die. It's kind of like doing the unbreakable vow from Harry Potter, where, yeah, you break it, you die. Obviously, Artemis is nowhere to be seen for most of the novel, except somehow she's able to track Lore and Castor down to the building they're at when Lore first discovers that Castor is the new Apollo, and there's a lot going on there too, which I'm just not going to get into because it was all pointless. I didn't understand why we had all these characters and all this backstory for characters who never made a reappearance. Like, they died and that was it. Except to say, oh, woe is me, nobody loves Lore because the house of Perseus is weak and blah blah blah. Artemis is gone, but then Lore steps in and says, Athena, you can't kill him, like he's on my side, like there's nothing wrong with him. But with him being the new Apollo, when a hunter becomes a new god, they are able to do things, like they're able to have that power. And then even in that interim between the 7 years, they're able to take on human form and live on Earth, which again wasn't explained very well. Yet for some reason Apollo couldn't do any of this. And that's actually something I thought was good. I thought that was a good subplot that maintained my interest, because I wanted to know, first off, Castor has no idea how he became the new Apollo. I want to know. So yeah, like you can string me along. And then, okay, so on top of the fact that he doesn't know how he became the new Apollo, we don't know why he's not acting like every other normal new god. Like, why didn't he inhabit the house that was set up for him? Why didn't he do things for his clansmen? Like, depending on who the god was, they could influence certain aspects of the regular world. Like Ares, he could start wars, and then those wars could then benefit his clansmen for various reasons. So why did he ever do anything to help his own people out? So that was all well and good. However, in the end, spoiler is Apollo, the original Apollo, was wounded. He came across Castor, who was basically on his deathbed, and he essentially aided Castor in killing him so that he could allow Castor to become the new Apollo. I guess something about that sacrifice meant that later on, when we do meet up with Artemis again, and then Castor / Apollo is shot by another character, it was a death shot, he doesn't die. So whatever this sacrifice that Apollo made, or because he did it with this realization that he was giving himself rather than having himself taken, enabled a new level of godhood, it was wishy-washy at best. As I said, too many ideas, unable to resolve them all. So yeah, that's Castor essentially. He's the new Apollo, doesn't know how he got there, has these superhuman abilities, yet not even superhuman. He has these abilities that other gods do not, yet he also doesn't have abilities that gods have. In the end, so here's the end of the book spoiler. What we find out is that Wrath, who is the person that Lore had assumed killed her family, had not actually killed her family. Not a good dude, and he is essentially the overarching villain. However, he wasn't very villainous because he made very few appearances. It was actually Athena who killed Lore's family, because each family, each hunter family, each descendant from a great mythological hunter had been given some kind of artifact, some relic. The Perseus clan had been gifted the Aegis, which is the shield with Medusa's head on it. It had been Athena's shield, but then Zeus gave it to the Perseus line. Sure, it's a great shield, but now only the Perseus line can wield it and have it be anything other than just a regular shield. And then on the back of the Aegis, there was a poem that was supposed to depict the Agon and the end of the Agon. And while everybody knew the basic idea behind the poem, apparently there was more to it that could teach you how to end all of this suffering and strife. What happened was that somebody stole the Aegis. So the Perseus had the Aegis. Wrath's clan, back many generations, had almost wiped out the Perseus clan, stolen the shield, and then what Lore did as a 10-year-old, she steals the Aegis back. And this is something I'm getting to the end, I promise. This is something that I thought was highly ludicrous, because even though she's able to wield it in a way that the normal person could not, the lack of security surrounding this shield and everything that they've stolen, their trophy room, if you will, was laughable. And so I simply could not believe that Laura was able to do it with such ease. But in any case, what had happened was earlier that day, her parents, who had been hunters, came back from the Agon early, and they said, we can't do it. We're not going to be part of this anymore. Laura, who is really angry because she had this vision of being a great hunter, like the greatest hunter, is so mad at her parents for their weakness that she decides, I'm going to go steal the Aegis so that they realize that the House of Perseus is important. And then when she gets home, she realizes her entire family has been murdered. Then the entire book, she denies the fact that she stole the Aegis, because that's what Wrath keeps saying to her is, we know, or I know, you took it. Where is it? So deny. Finally, at the end, we learn that she did actually take it, and then she hid it in the sewer? Over 7 years? I mean, I guess because the Aegis is inherently heavy, like a couple tons, it is possible that water had not washed it away or like dislodged it from where it's leaning up against the wall of the sewer. But what she does is she and her compadres figure out what Wrath's ultimate plan is, which is to sacrifice the city of New York for Zeus so that Zeus will end the Agon, declare him the winner, blah, blah, blah. And then we learn that actually Wrath and Athena had teamed up, because Athena, in hunt for the Aegis, had killed Laura's family, thinking that she could get information out of them, which is another thing I didn't understand, because if Laura had just stolen the Aegis literally that night, possibly 1, maybe 2 hours before, how did Athena know she had it? So why would Athena think to go to her family? None of it makes sense to me. So then we're down at Grand Central Station. Laura is fighting Athena. Laura's fighting Wrath, and somehow she gets Athena to realize that Wrath is not the person to team up with. And then Wrath nearly kills her. So then Athena sacrifices herself so that Lore can then become the new Athena. She defeats Wrath, things are falling apart, and Castor comes and gets her, and blah, 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 blah. They save the city, and blah, 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 blah. So then we end with this basically an epilogue in which it is the end of the Agon. Lore, who has never wanted to be a new god, even though she wanted to defeat Wrath, she never wanted to kill him. And so essentially when she teamed up with Athena, she said, look, I'm gonna go after Wrath, but I want you to kill him. So now, end of the Agon, and she is the new Athena. She's a god. She and Castor are hugging and kissing and loving and all whatever you want to say. And they're just like, we don't want to go. We don't want to go. It's like Doctor Who, where I don't want to go. And so she prays to the gods, or she prays to Zeus to essentially take it away from them. And he does. So now they're normal people, and they're gonna, live happily ever after. I mean, not like it's a bad thing. It was definitely unexpected, an unexpected resolution. It was rather sappy, and I would have preferred there to have been a more definitive answer or resolution to their problem. I still don't understand why they didn't want to be gods. I guess they just wanted to be normal people, which is fine. I'm assuming all of this means that the Agon is over. They ended the Agon, even though I don't quite know how they ended the Agon. Maybe it was Lore sacrificing herself, or Athena sacrificing herself. It's convoluted, guys. There's a lot going on. I kind of wanted Lore to be able to do something aside from praying to a god that she has shunned the last 7 years. But back to characters. There's Iroh. Iroh is one of the most pointless characters in this entire novel. I had high hopes for her, but in the end, what was the point? After Lore's family died, there was this huge cover-up so that nobody knew what had happened, and then there were the rumors that basically they just hightailed it out of there. But she goes to live with Iroh, who is part of another clan, the Odyssetes. They become like sisters. And this is something, it's not that I minded this. I just thought it was underdeveloped again. And in some ways, it added to Lore's woe is me, everything is my fault mentality, and I cannot stand that in a main character. Not that there isn't a time and a place for it, but I guess I've been reading a lot of books lately in which that is what every character is thinking, and I'm over it. I'm so tired of people, main characters, taking the world on their shoulders and saying, all the problems are because of me. Okay, really, the world does not revolve around you, even in fiction. But what happens is the leader of their clan, I'm not sure how many girls he's done this to, but he's a pedophile, and he tries to assault Lore, who ends up killing him. This leads her to running away because she can't face the retribution. She does not want to know how people are going to react to what she has done, and she believes that Iroh hates her for it. Then, in the pursuit of the Aegis and the poem, she is led to Iroh because somehow she believes that Iroh knows what the poem is. When they find Iroh, so Iroh's dad had become the new Aphrodite. So they find him and basically all of the Odyssetes under siege by Wrath because he is after Iroh, because we're assuming he's after the poem as well, which you never really know what Wrath wants. We have 1, 2, maybe 3 instances in which we see Wrath before the end, and then it's over. And I'm like, what was the point of Wrath? He ends up killing Iroh's dad. Iroh herself is locked in this vault. What Lore remembers is that there's a back way into it. So she and Athena do what they need to do to get to Iroh, only to find out that Iroh opened the door to Wrath. So things are in chaos, but they save Iroh, only for them to not actually do anything with Iroh, and they split up. Then they come together, and this is when Castor gets shot, because for some reason Iroh thinks that she needs to kill Castor. Oh, I know what it is. She wants Castor dead so that whoever kills Castor can become the new Apollo, so that their clan can have a god again. What bothers me about this part is that Lore's not upset with Iroh. Even though Iroh is supposed to be her best friend, even though Iroh just killed Lore's love interest / other best friend, there was no reconciliation between the two. There was no, oh, I'm sorry for what I did, and I forgive you, and I've missed you, and let's team up. But then it was like, well, we need weapons, so can the Odyssetes please give us weapons? And I was like, Iroh, why do I need to hear so much about Iroh when Iroh is a non-entity? So then there's Gil. After Lore became an orphan, she became something of a nomad until she ran across this gentleman named Gil. I forget where they were. I want to say in India or some kind of Middle Eastern country. She runs across him and he has been injured. It just so happens that he's from New York, and he takes her on as a carer as he heals, and then he becomes something more of an adoptive father. So she moves into his brownstone, and then somehow Miles comes into the picture and he moves into the brownstone. I think it's one of those deals where Gil owns the brownstone, but it's full of apartments. Gil dies right before the new Agon starts. Laura is devastated. She has inherited everything from him, even though she refuses to use any of it. So she lives in the brownstone and she acts as the superintendent, but she refuses to use any of the money that was left to her, which is why she resorts to street fighting. What we learn about Gil, we get a lot of sadness concerning the loss of Gil, which was effective until you learn that Gil was Hermes. And Hermes was the god that was killed by Wrath in that prologue, that very, very confusing prologue. We're given this information by another new god who is like loco in the cabeza. And so you don't know, is he telling the truth? Is he not telling the truth? Ultimately, yes, he's telling the truth. And so now Lore is pissed. She is so mad about Gil's deception. I think the underlying root of Gil's motivation, of Hermes' motivation, was to learn where the Aegis was. So for me, it took it from a really great plot twist to what in the world is happening. I still don't understand why everybody's looking for the Aegis. I understand why Athena wants the Aegis, because she considers that to be her shield. That is something her dad gave to her. I get it. I get her motivation, but why does everybody else care about the Aegis? Did Gil eventually come around to Lore and start to legitimately love her? Or did he always have an ulterior motive? Because he did give her this charm pendant that shielded her from other gods. Like, you couldn't find her. You didn't know where she was. Is that him trying to take care of her, or is that him keeping her away from prying eyes so that he could get what he wanted? So I enjoyed Gil until I learned who he really was. While I liked the essence of that, and I didn't mind being tricked, I guess because I didn't understand why he did what he did, and there was no real explanation because there was a lot of what if. So then there is Van, who is Castor's best friend. And he and Miles, it's very obvious. So we know that Miles is into guys. We don't really know what's going on with Van. We know that he and Lore have never gotten along, that somehow at some point his hand had been cut off. He is a good guy, but he's not a good guy. Initially, I liked not knowing if I could trust him. Over time, he became extremely unnecessary. He was more like the armament man, the guy who could get us what we needed without actually being a crucial character. He had very little backstory. This has nothing to do with personal preferences when it comes to sexuality. This comes from, holy cow, this was one of the sappiest, most obvious romance evolutions known to man, where we would see him giving Miles longing looks when Miles wasn't looking, or touching Miles when that's not the kind of thing that Van would do, or just these really, really sappy romantic moments where I was like, okay, I get it. He likes Miles, and Miles likes Van, and eventually they're gonna get together. Could we please make it more interesting? But I think by nature of the fact that neither character was that necessary, the entire romance aspect felt more like, I need to get this in there for the sake of equality than for the sake of the novel. And I have a problem with that in any sense of the word. I know that by nature, any form of media is about a message. I know that we all have a point to get across. We all have something we want to say. But for me, I hate that. It just comes down to whenever I have to write a book and I'm going through my structure and outline. It's like, what's the theme? What's your message? Does there have to be a message? Can it just be something like, I want something to escape? I get it. Bracken wants to get the message out that she believes in equality, that she believes that people should be able to love who they love and live the kind of lives that they believe that they should be allowed to live. But for me, if it doesn't further the plot, it doesn't need to be there. And their romance, like those characters, period, if we had cut them out, somebody else could have accomplished what they did. So there you go. Van. There's a lot of supposition as to why and how he lost his hand and why and how he has the place within his clan that he does. But I'm like, are we gonna actually get to know Van at all? Or is he just gonna be that guy who's in and out, who he has the money to get the information, or he has the money to get the tools, or he has the money to do this, or he has the reputation to do that? And I'm like, we didn't need him. We really didn't. Final character I want to talk about is Tidebringer. So this entire time I've been telling you that Lore is the last of her line, and that's actually not true. Many generations past, her ancestor, and somehow this is something of shame, I never quite understood why, her ancestor brought down Poseidon. If you haven't figured it out, every new god comes up with a name that evokes the god that they became. So the assumption at the beginning of this book is that all of the original gods, save for Athena and Artemis, have been killed, and then Tidebringer had been captured, because I guess when the Agon happens, they all land in a certain spot. How in the world the hunters know where to wait for them, I don't know, because in that review, it made it sound like this time they were in New York, so maybe last time they were in California. How the hunters know where to find them, I don't know. My thought was, it's always in New York. They always land in Central Park. Whatever. But the assumption was that Tidebringer had been captured. Within being captured, she had died. No, she had not died. And I was really excited when we ran across her, because the entire book you hear about Tidebringer, whose name I could never remember. I kept thinking her name was like Wavebreaker or something equally stupid. Almost as soon as we find Tidebringer and she's giving us information and she's on the brink of giving us that final piece of the puzzle, Athena kills her. And I was like, are you serious? Again, why do we have this character who is completely unnecessary? Why are we talking about Tidebringer when Tidebringer brought nothing to the table? And then that reminds me, when Athena kills Tidebringer, she and Lore get into it, and they are fighting each other. Lore is under the impression that if she kills herself, then that will bring Athena down, only for Athena to reveal, I didn't actually bind myself to you. You're a moron for thinking I would do that. Lore's on the brink of death. She goes into this out-of-body state where I guess we're supposed to assume that if she continues, then yes, she's dead. So she sees the figures of her family, and then she sees the figures of all of the original gods who are no longer with them, either because they're embodied by a hunter or a new god, or because they had been wiped out entirely. Then Castor, who, can you please tell me how he found her? Actually, I know how he found her. Miles had turned on the Locate Me app on Lore's phone, even though apparently it wasn't reciprocated. She couldn't find him when he had been kidnapped by Artemis. Castor comes in the nick of time, and his power as Apollo is to heal people, and so he does. I was really confused as to that whole out-of-body experience, and what was it supposed to mean? Why the family I got, but the lineup of the gods I did not. Maybe it was explained and I completely blew past it, but I feel like that must have been the entire book for me, because there was so much in this book that I was like, what? Why are we here? Why are we talking about this? Why is this important? Why are these characters around? I didn't like this book. Can I say it any more plainly? Probably. But let me see if I have anything more to talk about, because I feel like I've gone really, really long. The last thing, and I know there were plenty of points where I said I'll get back to that. So if I didn't actually get back to that, please put it down below and I'll try to give you your answers. What I need to do is actually keep a notepad and be like, get back to X, get back to Y. Anywho, this has nothing to do with the book so much as it has to do with the narration, the audiobook. So I've already talked about how unrelatable, or when I say I talked about it, I read somebody else's opinion and agreed with it, about Laura's unrelatability. The narrator, it wasn't that she was bad, but she gave Laura a very cynical tone that compounded the problems I had with her, that made it even harder to like her, made it harder to root for her, made me say, why do I want to care about Laura? Like, why does her story matter? And so I'm like, yeah. So I would just be very careful listening to the audiobook. I think you might actually benefit from reading the book, because then you can narrate it your own way and perhaps soften Lore and therefore like Lore better. And that reminds me, before I ever got into Lore, I had heard great things about it, and I bought the book. Since I hated it so much, I figured, you know what? Maybe I'll give it to somebody who's gonna appreciate the book. I never opened it. It is brand new. Ta-da! Hardback cover of Lore. First time it's opened is right now on camera. I'm going to do a giveaway for this book because it's just gonna collect dust on my shelf. So if you want this book, comment, subscribe, like, do all those really fun things. Tell me something you hated about this review. Tell me something you loved about this review. Tell me something about Alexandra Bracken's writing that you really enjoy. Do anything that tells me that you actually paid attention, and you'll be entered into my drawing. So anyways, I will see you hopefully in a better time and place. Bye. I did think after finishing Lore and realizing, hey, you know what? I need to review it, that maybe I should go back and try to reread them. The problem is I bought them on audiobook. And then when I hated Wayfarer, I said, why am I keeping these audiobooks? So I sold them with the assurance that I had them backed up to my time machine. Well, you know what? That time machine said, I think not. And so I don't know if I'll ever find them again, because you know how expensive it is to get your external hard drive not repaired, but to get someone to go in and take information off of your external hard drive. It costs a pretty penny. So I have them, and unless I can find them for free somewhere else, those audiobooks are going to stay where they are, and we're going to move on.